Hello everyone and welcome to our podcast. I'm Shaquin and I will be your moderator today. I'm joined by my group member Charmin, Sean, and Angel. In this exposit, I will be discussing a major philosophical problem known as the problem of evil, especially through the works of J.L. Mackie. Mackie presents what's called a logical inconsistence challenge. He argues that three widely accepted religion beliefs are logically incompatible. So first, God is all-powerful. Second, God is perfectly good. Third, evil exists. According to the Mackie, if God is both able and willing to prevent evil, then evil should not exist. But since evil clearly does exist in the world, Mackie concludes that something must be wrong with at least one of those beliefs. Either God is not all-powerful, not perfectly good, or simply doesn't exist. Now, our goal today isn't to take a firm stance for or against Mackie's conclusion. Instead, we want to explore how people might respond to this problem. We will look at two types of response. Preservationists, which aim to defend traditional religion beliefs, and revisionary, which suggest changing or giving up some of those beliefs to resolve this contradiction. Let's begin with Sean, who will explain what preservationist responses involve and how they try to maintain consistency between belief in God and the existence of evil. So, Sean, from a preservationist perspective, can you explain how someone might try to defend belief in God without giving up on logic?
Of course. The preservationist response argues that there's no real disagreement between God being all good and all powerful and evil existing seems like a contradiction. One of the best known examples is a free will defense. It suggests that God gave us freedom because moral choice is more valuable than programmed goodness. So evil exists because people misuse that freedom, not because God is wicked or powerless.
Okay, so would you say that it makes more sense for God to just stop evil, especially if he can?
I wish. The argument is that preventing evil would mean removing free will altogether. That would turn us all into moral robots. And like we saw in our monsters discussion, when reasoning sleeps, we make poor decisions, sometimes due to impulsivity monsters or cognitive blindness. Free will means we get to make mistakes and grow from them, but it also means that some people will do real harm.
So what about evils that aren't caused by human choice, like natural disaster?
That's where some preservationists turn to the soul-making theodicy. Like intellectual virtue development, we can see how we discuss intellectual vices as wishful thinking or negligence in the readings. Natural evils can be seen as opportunities for cultivating virtues like courage, empathy, and resilience. It may be a hard sell, but the idea is that personal growth and character development require real struggle.
So preservationists think the contradiction is only obvious?
Exactly. So when Mackie sees a contradiction, but preservationists argue that it's a bias in reasoning. For example, we often jump to conclusions too fast, like with the Linda problem or the bound ball puzzle. If we slow down and use critical reasoning, we can see there's another way to interpret the situation that doesn't involve contradiction.
Okay, so do people just believe this because they want it to be true?
That's where the self-awareness matters. As we saw in the intellectual vices slide, wishful thinking and closed-mindedness are real problems. But the best preservationist response challenge believers into reasoning more carefully, and to be open to objections and to refine their views. In that sense, we're trying to avoid these vices, not fall into them.
So how do we know if a preservationist response is actually convincing or just avoiding the hard truth?
Well, we have to ask whether the argument generally holds up to critical thinking or whether it's just rationalization. Like Dr. Marsh earlier said, when reason sleeps, monsters arise, such as dogmatism, conspiracy theories, or unchecked assumptions. So even if someone gives a preservationist reply, it still has to be examined carefully and fairly, or it just adds to the intellectual monsters we're trying to avoid.
Okay, thanks for Sean. Now let's talk to Charmin. So Charmin, from a revisionary point of view, can you explain how one might change their belief to follow Mackey's inconsistencies?
Absolutely. Mackey's argument highlights the issue regarding three attributes given to God as contradictory. One example of this would be to challenge the idea that God is omnipotent, as in, he is an all-powerful being and he can control everything. However, with evil still occurring in the world despite God's existence, and God being in control of everything, we might have to revise the moral standards and the definition of omnipotence as Mackey mentioned.
Okay, so does this negate the existence of free will?
Not necessarily, but it does challenge the idea that absolute free will justifies any amount of suffering. The claim that preventing evil would remove free will assumes that moral agency only exists if we have the capacity to do maximum harm. But a revisionary response asks, is this the really best possible world? Just like Peter Singer's New York Times article discusses the contradictions of common sense with other beliefs, Mackey's argument draws attention to a similar contradiction. If free will is good, God must allow all choices. But then we also believe a good being would stop horrific suffering when possible, ultimately leading back to Mackey's inconsistencies.
But couldn't someone argue that suffering leads to growth? That without the challenge of evil, we'd never develop virtues like compassion or courage.
As Sean mentioned before, like the soul-making theodicy, that would be an example of giving suffering a purpose, which leaves room for vices like wishful thinking and prioritizing emotional reassurance rather than reasoning, allowing the monsters a space to visit. In this case, Mackey's argument is regarding consistency, and if God's goal is character development, why allow random suffering like natural disasters that don't build virtue but simply destroy lives?
Okay, so would you say that belief in a traditional God is irrational?
I would say it becomes irrational when it refuses revision in the face of Mackey's contradiction. We also see this kind of thinking in biases like the decoy effect. For example, someone might accept a weak theological explanation like suffering builds character, not because it's the most reasonable view, but because it's less extreme than rejecting God altogether. It becomes a psychological middle option that feels safer, even if it doesn't fully make sense. But again, that's not good reasoning. That's just choosing beliefs based on comfort and not coherence.
So what would a revisionist actually believe in them?
I would say that varies. Some might still believe in a God, but a different kind, one who is evolving with the universe or is limited in its power, or one that's not perfectly good by human standards. Others might move away from theism altogether. The key point here is that they let logic shape their belief and not the other way around. Also, to have an open mind and to readily come with debiasing techniques when debating about such issue.
Okay, thanks for sharing. Now let's move to Angel. So Angel, when you look at both the preservationist and reversionary responses, how would you compare them? What stands out to you?
What stands out to me about these two types of responses is that they address the same problem, but through entirely different approaches. Preservationist response try to preserve the original framework of beliefs. They don't give up any core belief. Instead, they try to explain how things like evil still fit within their system. A well-known example of this is the free will defense, which Sean also mentioned it. It says God gave us freedom because making good choices only matters when we have the option to do wrong. I actually agree with this logic. If humans are programmed to only do good, then morality has no value. In addition to the free will defense, some preservationists approach evil from the perspective of moral and spiritual development. For example, the soul-making theology argues that suffering plays a necessary role in the normal growth of human beings, and that character traits such as empathy and resilience are often developed in the face of challenge or difficulties. So, from this perspective, evil is not a logical contradiction, but an inevitable part of the moral and psychological development of human beings.
Okay, Angel, and how does that compare to the revisionary side?
The revisionary response is different. It does not attempt to explain this contradiction, but instead choose to expect it. They say if something does not make logical sense, then the belief itself needs to be adjusted. That could mean rethinking what all-powerful really means, or even letting go of belief in God altogether. I think it takes courage to question belief you have held your whole life.
So, after breaking it all down, do you find yourself learning more theories in one side?
For me, both approaches actually demonstrate serious thinking about the issues, just in different directions. Preservationists look for answer within the belief system, while revisionists are more focused on keeping things logically consistent. I think both approaches are worth taking seriously. Philosophy isn't about avoiding tough questions, it's about facing them with honesty.
Okay, thanks for Angel, and that's the end of our podcast. Thanks for your listening.